Nobody wants to give me backup.
I'll back you up when I'm not talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can
Same
back you up
thing.
when Russ, you're presenting, so
Yeah.
or talking.
Yep. All right. Well, by my clock, it's time. So why don't we get going?
Who wants to do the welcome?
I'll do that. Okay, welcome to the SUIT working group. We are the second session of this virtual IETF. Welcome. And want to remind everyone about the note well. Basically, make sure you're aware of your rights and responsibilities here before you contribute either in writing or verbally. Next slide, please. I want to remind everybody about the IETF Code of Conduct. That's available in RFC 7154. Basically, please be respectful and courteous at all times. Remember, we're participating impersonally. That means no personal attacks and such. And remember that we're here to devise solutions that work in the global internet, which means that we need to consider the diversity and the operational environments that are available, and not just one way that one person uses the internet. And also be prepared to contribute in the ongoing discussions. So thank you. Next slide. So we just took care of note takers and Jabber Room Watcher. Thank you very much. The blue sheets will be automatically created by you logging in to the Medico session. Next slide. So this is the agenda, or at least the first slide of the agenda. Put the second one up and then ask, are there any bashes? We just heard from Brendan that his time went to the documents on the first slide. So we're basically have very little to say on items 5 and 6. Okay, let's go back to the previous slide.
That were mentioned, yeah, the trust domains and yeah.
Right. Basically, that's correct. The earlier item got divided up into multiple documents, and we'll talk about why. But let's talk about the status of the working group recharter. We had a long pause. Sorry, the chairs probably should have nudged that sooner after coming to some text. Then we put together some milestones and sent those to Roman. Roman has in turn updated that to the data tracker and had some minor discussions about some word changes. Go ahead, Roman.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I just wanted to check in. I think we are quite at the cusp of being done here. Thanks for kind of the new milestones. Everything's dropped in. My only remaining question before I would hit the send button is, what about a milestone on the order of what I just put in chat, which says, let's put a marker for when we coordinate with rats on where the document goes. I feel like given the dynamic in the group, it would be helpful if we put a pin in it to make sure it doesn't get away from us.
Well, I think I said in email, I don't think that's going to get away with us in the sense that right now it looks like RATS is going to drive that document. And so as long as we coordinate with them, we should leave the milestoning to them, was my thought. Dave, do you have any thoughts?
We got two Daves, so I don't know which one's first.
Well,
I
either one who has a view.
I'm okay either way. I think this is what's on here right now that Rowan was referring to. You can see this goes from next month out for 1 year with other things there. So I just wanted to call that up on the screen there. And I think, Roman, you're proposing that we have one that is a milestone for deciding where things go. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Because I guess my point is, if it's undecided, we should have a milestone. If it's actually going to rats, then we should probably update the core charter text, which seems to suggest that it's ambiguous.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I agree. It looks like it's going to rats right now, but the final decision I don't think has been made.
So shall we say by March? What do folks think is reasonable?
That's my opinion would be yes. Yeah.
Okay.
What actions
I don't
do
know if
we?
there's other people from rats, maybe. I know there's a couple other rats people on here between Michael and folks. If there's any objections to that, speak up.
What actions do we need to take in order to make this decision? Do we?
Well, last IETF, we had a discussion about a particular document, and we said, where should that go? And we had a discussion in both SUIT and in rats about where that should go. And as at the end of last IETF, there were two parts of the discussion. One was some general stuff, and one were SUIT-specific claims. And the real discussion we're having here is about the SUIT-specific claims. Okay, and so our SUIT-specific claims that's the rats profile for SUIT. Does that go in the rats working group or the CERT working group? That's the decision we're talking about.
Right. Hank, go ahead.
So either from my management chaos is to do that in rats, of course. But if there's a feasible reason that we should split it, I'm willing to listen. But for my personal convenience, I think keeping it in one place would be nice. And if that rats, I'm not against that.
No, I think that rats is the right home personally. That's just my thoughts, and could be convinced otherwise. But that we want to make sure this group reviews it, I think, is where we're landing. Michael.
So I'm just concerned that we feel like we had this conversation last time, and seems like that what we actually just need to have is a 20-minute virtual interim between now and March, probably before Christmas, where we just make sure that all the people are doing it and have a longer conversation about that. Not really like actually plan a joint meeting.
And Michael,
Yeah,
you're
so-
suggesting a combined meeting between rats and SUIT to discuss this draft.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to, be 3 hours long, right? It just
Sure.
has to happen, right?
Good suggestion. We'll coordinate with the rats chairs and figure out how to make that happen.
I see Brendan's also in queue.
Brendan?
This seems to me like a bit of a bellwether for what rats is going to look like going forwards. Does rats want to deal with every single other thing-specific set of claims, or does rats want that to land in the individual working groups? This ultimately, as near as I can tell, is more of an IANA decision than anything else. We have to register claim sets. So I'm a little bit confused as to why we're having this discussion at all. I thought it was reasonably clear that rats set up the base draft and the rest of its IANA registrations. I don't understand what we're doing here.
There's a SUIT profile and a individual submission right now that's a candidate for that type of work is draft Burke-Hull's SUIT claims, and the SUIT specific stuff is basically section 3.2 is an example of something that could be used to meet this. given that this is individual summation, we can't say that this is IETF and stuff, but we're talking about the part that's highlighted here on the screen is a candidate for that. And the question is whether this type of information would be in SUIT or in RATS. To answer your question, Brendan, when the RATS working group was first chartered, there was this discussion, and an analogy was given to things like how the DHCP or DHC working group works, where they form the base, but profiles are done in other working groups with DHC being the reviewer of them, but they don't do all the options, right? And so RATS could be the same thing, and that's the argument for why this might be done in the SUIT working group and why there would be a charter milestone that's at least a placeholder for the decision, if not the actual work, as to whether a SUIT profile and its any claims specific to the use of SUIT and the applicability and security considerations around them would be in a document, right? And so this is an example of a document just for everybody else here. A lot of people have looked at this, but if you haven't, then this is a placeholder for something that could meet that work. And in this example, you can see its use of, say, SUIT records is one type of thing that could be in claims. There could be claims about SUIT records and not the SUIT records themselves, but the point is that's the actual work that we're not trying to have here. The question is which charter does it belong in? And to your point, Brendan, there's a valid argument that says that it could belong in SUIT with RATS review, okay? And so that's the discussion, so. Hank is in queue.
Yeah, there are, I have to admit, there are less a small amount, but then very universal claims here. And I think then just sorting that out is the problem here. It's not about the registry. It's not about the actual, maybe not even about the actual working group, but it's about understanding what these claims mean and what scope they have. And then I think the rest is just easy legwork.
Yeah, there was a discussion for those who were in the RATS working group earlier. I raised this at the mic because there's some of the parts of this top part in Hank's document that has now been obsoleted by recent additions to the EAT document. And so an example that I called out in the meeting is this one right here. There's now this is pulled into the EAT document itself. Other things that are in here are things that might be in RATS because they're generic, not specific to SUIT, and then other ones are specific to SUIT. And so the point is this document right here has a mix of some things that are SUIT specific and some that are not. And it could be that the non-SUIT specific ones go into RATS and the SUIT specific ones go into SUIT, but that's kind of the ongoing discussion. So.
And it sounds like that might be the topic of discussion if we have this interim.
Yep. Although I think the topic of the interim was specifically about the SUIT specific things, because my hope is that the non-SUIT specific stuff could be worked out long before an interim. If not, some of those would be worked out by Friday based on the RATS meeting discussion of this week, meaning by the end of the IETF week here. But the SUIT specific ones, I think having an interim would be helpful for, because regardless of which one it's in, we want review from both groups, and having that be a topic, even if it's a short interim meeting, that would be very useful. So I agree with that suggestion. Is
there any chance to get the philosophical discussion about where these extensions should be worked? Is there any chance that that will get resolved in the RATS meeting later this week?
No, I don't think so. Well, that's my opinion. I know there's other RATS people on here, but that's because here the question is about the SUIT profile. My belief is this. My personal belief is aligned with I think what Brendan said, which is the RATS working group would probably prefer that profiles be done in the working group that the profile is for. In other words, they would probably kick the SUIT specific stuff over to SUIT, but that's me trying to predict what they would say.
Okay.
Yeah, and then there's a question of timing. And I think the session is already full.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
It sounds like some coordination is going to be necessary to move forward.
Yeah. But I think to answer Roman's question, my opinion is yes, I think it's fine to put in a milestone that says make a decision by March, with the wording that Roman posted in chat.
Awesome. So I will put that in as a milestone, and then I will submit it for the ISG for initial review, so we can keep things moving. Thanks for everyone's help here.
Thanks, Roman.
finished the working group recharter summary. We don't have slides for the hackathon, but is there somebody who wants to say something about that, how that went and what we learned?
Hi, this is Hannes again. Yeah, we had, I gave a presentation at the end of the hackathon week, which can be looked up, and I will share the link in the chat window. Don't have that ready. Don't want to go through that slide deck, but in a nutshell, we had a number of folks showing up. Emmanuel organized several presentations, which I didn't look at the attendee list, but some of you attended for sure. Those were good presentations. They have been recorded per request, so they are up there. I will also share the link. Slides are available. The purpose of the presentations was to give people a quicker introduction into some of the tools and the code on Riot and the extensions made for SUIT, and point us to the code that Brandon had been working on, etc., etc. So that was pretty good. We had some hacking events as well on different fronts, so it was a little scattered all over the place with regards to activities. The links to the code are also in the slide deck. I still owe a couple of folks hardware. Unfortunately, that the ordering process was a little bit difficult. So hold your breath, and will work out in the end. I also noticed, and I think that's the lesson learned, is like it's getting more and more difficult for people to really sort of do these hackathons or in general these online events, because there's so many concurrent activities going on. So you have to be extremely disciplined to actually follow things through. But I'm still hoping either that we switch over to face-to-face hackathons again, or that we sort of become very creative in organizing those, given the time zone differences and all the other problems. So, yeah. But if anyone of you has interest to look at the code or has some questions on the presentations or anything else, just drop me an email, or Emmanuel in this case as well, since he has been helping to organize this hackathon event on SUIT and Deep and etc. I'm sure we can help.
Hey Hannes, could you provide a link to the slides?
Yes. Give me a second to look it up.
Sure, thanks.
Okay, we ready to move on to the next presentation?
Seeing any questions, so let's go to Brendan.
Hi. So I guess next slide, please.
You're also invited to turn on your camera if you like.
Oh yeah, I can do that, can't I? I have terrible Wi-Fi at my house, so this is a strange and new experience that I can actually use video again. Okay, so the key changes for SUIT Manifest 16 are essentially what we discussed last time in IETF 111. The most important thing that's changed is that we have broken the manifest document apart into 4 or theoretically 5 different drafts. The 5th draft, I'll mention briefly later on what it would be if it existed, but it doesn't exist. So that's the primary bit of the work. There's also 2 minor changes that were added in. The integrated element keys, so that would apply to integrated payloads and integrated dependencies. Those are both have minor changes. I'll get to that in a minute. And then there's the URI definition, and that's had a minor change as well. Next slide, please. So what is covered in the core document now is the authentication, basic flow control, so the try each and multiple components mechanisms, parameter setting, but only override parameters. And the reason for that is that set parameters should not be necessary unless you have multiple manifests. And this doesn't cover multiple manifests. Severable members, so that's the elements being taken out of the manifest and placed in the manifest envelope. And finally, the text description. Those are essentially what's covered by the current core specification. Next slide, please. Well, you can see here that we made an effort to ensure that the core specification is simple, because here's the list of what's not covered. We don't have delegation, so that will mean that any form of key delegation has to happen out of band or using the trust domains specification. Similarly, dependency manifests are covered in trust domains, and multiple suit processors are covered in trust domains. The multiple suit processors, just as a reminder, oh no, that'll come up in a later presentation. I'll leave that for now. Payload transforms are the one thing that doesn't have a dedicated document. We do have one for encrypted firmware, but we don't have one for any form of compression. We do the conditions for managing updates and directives and metadata for managing updates are in the separate update management specification, or individual draft, I mean. So that's those are up and coming, but they are not covered in the core specification anymore. So those things are no longer right in the core, which will hopefully simplify it substantially. Next slide, please. The integrated element keys. So I alluded to this earlier, but the idea here was that the original specification had a somewhat cumbersome mechanism for referring to integrated elements. So if you had an integrated payload, you had to use a fragment-only reference URI, and that fragment-only reference had to be a number, and that number had to convert to a specific range of integer, and that on doing it that on constrained devices seemed like it was more cumbersome than necessary. So this change says that instead of doing that, it will be direct text string matching. So you have a text string key for your integrated element, which guarantees that it won't collide with any future extensions. And that text string will be identical to the text string reference that's placed in the URI field. So the one additional thing that this enables, which is hopefully useful, is that an intermediary can prefetch a payload and embed it in the manifest envelope, and then as long as a device knows to start by checking the manifest envelope for the appropriate text string and then perform a remote fetch, then pre-caching can be done in a relatively straightforward way. Next slide, please. This is a simple change. Previously, the manifest specification referred to URIs. Now it makes it explicit that that's a URI reference, and it's not strictly necessary to have the fully qualified domain name, etc. Next slide, please. So we have a few open issues. At IETF111, we discussed the need for more information on implementation overhead for hierarchical hash-based signatures. One of the pieces of information was verification time, and thanks to the work done by Emmanuel's group, we know that The verification time is roughly on the order of 1/3 of an ECDSA verification. It's slightly longer than an EDDSA verification. We don't really know why this is yet, as far as I know, but I would, one of the possibilities is that libraries are frequently optimized for performing one long hash rather than many small hashes. So it remains to be seen what happens if we have more optimized digest libraries that are targeted specifically at HSS LMS and can handle doing lots of small digests. So just as a summary, the choice for a mandatory to implement signature algorithm appears to be between ECDSA and HSS LMS. The single biggest problem with ECDSA is that it's not quantum resistant. The benefits it has are primarily the maturity of the tooling. The long verification time, obviously not a benefit. For HSS LMS, the biggest detractors it has are probably that it's got relatively immature tooling. It itself is not immature, just the tooling. The private keys require ongoing maintenance, which essentially means that after each signature, the private key needs to be updated. And there's only a fixed number of signatures possible, and signature sizes are at least 1 kilobyte. That's in fact, I think it's 1280 bytes is the bare minimum. So that's essentially the trade-off that we have to decide on if we're going to have only a single mandatory to implement signature algorithm. Next slide, please. So we need to also discuss what we're going to do for optional to implement algorithms. RSA has been requested, but I think that we should be very careful about permitting that, given some of the research that's going on in that area. There's also a question as to whether we should have failover options for digest algorithms. Particularly where bootloaders are concerned, this becomes a really big question about whether we can actually afford to have any crypto agility. So I'm looking for advice or input or recommendations on the topic of crypto agility and constrained devices. So that's an open question, if that's anything that we can, if there's any advice we have there. And I think that is it. Is there another slide?
I think we want to open it for discussion here, I guess. Okay, Russ, you're in queue. Go ahead.
So a good bit of our crypto agility comes from just using the COSE constructs. The registries already exist, but we do need to have mandatory implements. I think the may implements are anything else that's registered.
So my concern with that approach is that that works really well in the non-constrained environments where updates are straightforward. But when we look at the constrained environment, where there are certain parts of the device that simply can't be updated, like ROM bootloaders or early stage processes, we really need to be careful about what gets mandated. And I think we've had some discussions with on the subject of that with MCU boot in the past as well.
So sure, I agree with all of that, but I think that's a constraint that is outside the protocol, and I don't know what we would put in the protocol to address that. But Dave's in queue. Go ahead.
Well, I have a question, and I don't know whether the question will help or not, and it's not a preference, it's actually a question, because there's a couple things that we could do. when we're talking about mandatory to implement, I'm going to just go back a slide because this is the mandatory to implement question on this one, because the other ones are talking about optional implement. So one way, there's a couple different approaches you can take with doing MTI, because you have to say it's mandatory to implement for whom, right? Because in the suit, there's at least two roles, arguably more, right? There's the manifest author and there's the manifest consumer. And maybe there's a manifest intermediary, depending on whether you count that as opaque. Is that suit enlightened in any way? Whether there's a third role or not, maybe depends. Okay, and so mandatory to implement for whom, right? So for some classes of protocol, you can say that the same thing is mandatory to implement on both ends, right? And for other examples is where you have multiple possibilities on one end. It's pick one on one end and multiple that are collectively mandatory to implement on the other end. And so, for example, and again, this is not a recommendation, this is part of the question, you could say that both of these are mandatory to implement on authoring sides and the consuming side gets to pick one or some other variation, right? I'm saying as long as you can guarantee that an author and a parser can talk to each other, there's multiple ways to accomplish that, right? And so the question of the working group is, do we want to pick one for all roles, or do we want to allow different roles to have different ways of phrasing the question? In other words, multiple possibilities versus multiple required mandatory to implement. And so which way do we want to frame the question is the question that I have for the working group. So. I bring that up only because of Brendan's last point about constrained devices, right? If you said, well, some constrained devices could only do, ECDSA because they're immediate, they need mature tooling. Other constrained devices might only be able to do the other one because the verification time is lighter or whatever. Is that a blocker to make them be mandatory to implement on a per use case basis and say authors have to be capable of doing either of them? There's just different ways to skin it, right? Which way do we want to craft the requirement is the question. So. Constrained implementations. I don't know if like David Brown or anybody has a particular opinion on this one.
I suspect that's the way we have to do it, is that we have to specify that the author has a list of mandatory to implement algorithms, but that the recipient gets to pick one.
Waltmar, go ahead, David Brown.
The comment I would make is probably the same as it was at 111, that I just fear that picking something as mandatory to implement is going to mean we're going to end up with a lot of non-compliant implementations. The way MCU boot works is you pick at compile time what implementations you have available in a given build, and there's a lot of really resource constrained, like where we try to get the bootloader to fit into 16 kilobytes, and it's going to be pretty hard to pick more than one algorithm. And if the one somebody wants isn't one that we've picked as mandatory, they're not going to be able to pick the other one. So I don't know what that means as far as compliance or, what we're trying to say by saying it's mandatory.
I think that the idea here is that we're trying to set the target for interoperability. I mean, it seems like David, based on your comment, that we're either going to end up with non-compliant solutions or non-interoperable solutions, or both, based on some of the resource constraints. I think what we're trying to accomplish through this is at least trying to define a baseline for interoperability, which I think is the best that we can do.
Okay, Michael.
So I can see David's point of view because he's building a library which is going to be put and probably put to a vendor who's going to put it in a early stage ROM, and I can see that quandary that he has. But the author, assuming this is a manufacturer, not someone who operates the network, they're going to put the algorithm to which they put test anchors into the device board. because anything else is stupid. So we can argue a lot about what is the mandatory to implement from a point of view of what we would like to see out there, what we'd like to recommend. But if trust anchor is not there, then it doesn't matter. And that's within the ability of the organization who built the device to decide and coordinate without our help. So I think strongly that we should say hash-based signatures should be the mandatory to implement in our document. And there very well may be non-compliant implementations out there for a while, and that perhaps what will push this, immature tooling forward. And I don't see another way, and I don't really see any other sense in doing any other.
Quality was not great, but I think I understood your main point to be an argument that we should make HSS LMS be the mandatory one. I think that was the bottom line after some rationale in there. If I got that wrong, please post in the chat. Akira?
Yeah, it's for the mandatory or requirement, anything goes into suit, it's going to be mandatory automatically for the TEEP. And if the EAT is going to have any mandatory or required algorithm, it's automatically going to be in the requirement for the TEEP. So I prefer suit, TEEP, EAT, not selecting different mandatory algorithm. Yeah, that's all.
I guess I have one question. We had a discussion previously about how we specify capability reporting, and forgive me, I don't actually recall. No, I have not submitted a draft on capability reporting, but that is something that I think we should probably do. Does this discussion of mandatory to implement become irrelevant if we specify a capability reporting system? Can we just get away from worrying about it at all?
So it's an interesting question because you're specifying a manifest to do something, right? And the thing that you're going to do, like install code, and you can't have code that's going to work on arbitrary numbers of things, right? So your suit manifest is actually crafted for a particular class of system, right? And so you got to have that knowledge, or you couldn't have crafted that. So in other words, it at least has to be internally consistent, right? If the type of system that could run the binary that you're referencing is the one that has the algorithm that you know of, and you can and as the author you can correlate that information, then you're crafting an internally consistent suit manifest. And so whether it becomes irrelevant, I don't know. I think the real requirement is that you can craft a suit manifest that's consistent with the type of entity that could actually run the thing being expressed by the suit manifest.
Yeah, and from following on from that argument, I have to ask, do we need to tie down the signature algorithm with a mandatory to implement one? Or is it adequate for for there to be consistent pairs of author and consumer?
Okay, so while I'm at the mic, let me just finish what I was going to say, and then I'll pass it to David Brown. I think the only case that I can think of where my previous statement doesn't hold is if you do have, say, an intermediary that does things with suit manifest without being able to do the binary itself, right? It's just a forwarder, but it may do things like, oh, I do the countersigning for them, that type of thing. And if I need to be able to countersign, I don't care whether I interpret the binary, I have to be able to interpret the suit manifest. And that's where I think the MTI stuff may actually apply. And so, David, you're up next.
Yes, I was actually going to make something kind of a similar point to what you just said. We have some configurations we're considering where the device that is being updated may not be network connected. And there's you might call it a helper device, an intermediary. It may be something on the same board that's a more powerful processor that it needs to be able to take this firmware blob in this manifest and kind of pass it through. And it would be nice if it was able to verify the signature and, not do operations that are unnecessary. does that mean now do we just have 3 parties and we need to make sure they all agree on what algorithm is done there? That, you know, when it really comes down to it, it is up to just the parties participating, the people making the firmware and the device needing to agree on this. And that, I mean, that's how we're doing it now. When you build MCU boot, you pick the signature algorithm that's used, and you better sign it with that same one or it's not valid. So as far as MTI, I'm not sure I see the benefit.
So I just want to, just as chair, I want to understand what we're actually saying here. So I think what's being said is that there are multiple parties that may be working together in an ecosystem. And I think what we're suggesting is that the signature algorithm or algorithms that get implemented within a given ecosystem will effectively be sorted out by those parties. And because of that, we don't need an MTI. Is that what's being said?
I think so.
CR Michael saying he strongly agreed with me, and so I'm going to try to say what I was going to say, and hoping that this is what he strongly agreed with. I think what I was concluding is that because you can have these middle entities, such as a cosigner type of a role, right, which is not, you know, the destination that's not running the suit manifest, but I may have to parse the suit manifest to construct one that references it or construct a derivative that replaces it, whatever it is, right? And so for that, I think having MTI is important. So I guess my straw man from what I've heard so far, not strong, is that constrained devices can pick either ECDSA or HSS LMS, but must pick one of those two to claim compliance. And that authors and cosigners and things must implement both. So both are mandatory to implement on the other roles. That's kind of where I'm arguing, and I think that's what would give interoperability for scenarios like co-signing and so on, and, you know, referencing dependency manifests and so on, but still leave the freedom to constrain devices to pick the most appropriate one within the set of MTIs. So I guess that would be my proposal on the table right now from what I've heard so far.
Dave, just a clarifying question. You know, what if authors are writing manifests for a specific set of devices where they know, you know, the signature method that's being used? Would they have to support both in that case?
You're asking me my proposal, and so I will answer my opinion. What the rest of the working group says, I can't say, but my opinion is if you're a manifest author that's authoring something for a particular device, you might think you know what that device has, okay? But if the actual device is not going to process your manifest, the actual one is going to process, because you may not know the actual device. You're doing it for a class of devices. The actual device might do one that's done by a countersigner instead, right? You're the manufacturer of the software or something, so you construct one. But the administrator of the device says, I'm actually going to parse that myself, and I'm going to replace it with my own that's the countersign, because I've got the signature he's actually going to trust, right? And so the only entity that parses it might not actually be the device. And so that's my argument for why MTIs are important, even if you think you know the device. So, but I see Michael is in queue, so maybe you have a better idea.
I'm just going to say that I hope my audio is better. That I think you captured what I was strongly agreeing with, but the subset issue is that the author knows what the manufacturing author knows what's available, so they're not going to go outside of that list, period. Okay, it's not even about guessing. They constructed the device, they know what's available, period. Now, what your point is, Dave, and I agree with strongly, but that might not be the trust anchor the device is going to trust, because it might be an operator thing. The operator has to pick a trust anchor, or has to pick an algorithm that the device can support. Finally, I would say that I'm not sure I would say ECDSA and HS and hash-based signatures, it's too hard to pronounce that, are a must. I actually would say ECDSA is a should. And the case where you shouldn't use it is when it's been defeated or you don't have code space for it, right?
Must, ECDSA is a should. And the other ones on the next slide were maze.
I think we're on that topic, though. I think we're rehashing a little bit about what we talked about at IETF 111. You know, we did a poll and we talked about, you know, the two, and there was strong consensus towards if we had a single one, a single MTI to make the hash-based, the MTI. I think that was largely driven by the discussion around quantum resistance. So we wanted something that would last.
Well, I guess as chairs, are we ready to say that we have, between this discussion and the discussion we had there that you were just summarizing, David, are we saying that that is the proposed consensus? Let us know if we've misread consensus.
That makes sense to me.
Ira asks a question in the chat about why ECDSA being a should rather than EDDSA is the question. Okay, Michael just responded to the answer. Okay. All right.
Well, I mean, from that perspective, perhaps we need to have a few more options available in the optional to implement.
Yep. So I'm just doing a time check. We're at 15 minutes after the hour now. Do we want to go on to the next presentation now?
I think maybe this is one for the list.
Well, I think
exactly
we
what we're proposing.
We need to confirm it on the list. I think that's right. That HSSLMS will be the mandatory, that ECDSA is a should, and anything else is a may.
We're declaring as the consensus from this discussion, which we will then need to confirm on the list. So I think we can go on to the next presentation unless there's any objections or new technical information. So. I think firmware encryption is up next.
Yeah, we've only got 15 minutes left, so we kind of need to pick up the pace.
Yep. So who's presenting this one?
Okay, I tried to be fast. Hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
We hear you fine.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so this is a short update on the firmware encryption. We had a good discussion at the last IETF meeting, and there were two main aspects there. One was to take the HPKE, the hybrid public key encryption, and make that a standalone COSI method, which we did. There's a separate document available, and that would be discussed in the COSI working group. I'm not going into the details, so essentially was extracted content from the SUIT working group document that was brought into this one. And the other thing was we had two attacks listed and in the presentation from the last IETF meeting, and those, or the mitigations of those, have been incorporated into this version, and I have two slides that talk about those, just as a summary on what the solution is. The first one was an issue with sort of where to put the sort of the content of the encryption information, because it had to be in the envelope, and so it couldn't be in the manifest. So that's what we did. This is essentially something that was carried over from Brendan's presentation about the document split. So conceptually, this was in the SUIT manifest specification, just in a different language, I would say. So this is just essentially the SUIT encryption info tag in the envelope. The envelope, as a reminder, is not protected by the digital signature itself, but the manifest is. Okay, next slide. And the other one was about a verification sort of mechanism to allow the prevention of battery exhaustion. So when the device receives the firmware update, it wants to perform as little operations as possible to determine whether the payload it receives is actually correct. or it has been properly signed and properly encrypted in this specific case, actually. And so what we did here is, and there's still a do be done here, but there, in a nutshell, the idea is that there is a byte sequence in the manifest that is where we apply the content encryption key on a string of 8 bytes with a specific character, like this, in this case, hex A5. It doesn't really matter what it is, but that allows the consumer to check with the KEK that it got whether this this string actually decrypts properly. So the only open issue here is what IV to use, and that's in the document. That's something we still have to hash out. But yeah, okay, good. So this was sort of the current sort of updates and the approaches for addressing the threats that we talked about last time, and we also talked about different solutions. This is one of them, so please have a look at this. There's also code for the HB key, which I created, and I've also been working on a COSI, the corresponding COSI code, which I need to clean up and will be published out soon. What we are still lacking is interrupt testing on this functionality, unlike for some of the other features in the main specification, which we have tested already. And I just talked about this open issue a second ago. And yeah, that's all there is. So I hope the discussion in the COSI meeting goes well, so that we can then reference this. Of course, there will be changes. I expect changes to the COSI HBKE document itself, as we try to make it more general and applicable to use cases beyond firmware encryption. But I think that's a good approach going forward. Cool. That's all I had for the firmware encryption.
Okay, so those are two current working group documents. The other two, although they came split out of the working group document, they're current individual submissions. Do we have a preference between the other two, which one to cover, given that we've got 8 minutes left here, between trust domains and update management?
My preference.
I observed that you told us the thinking behind the split out in your previous presentation. So I think we leave it to Brendan to tell us where the open issues might lead to more group participation.
I think
Brendan, which one would you like to go to?
is probably the more interesting one, especially because of the TEEP dependency.
Trust domains?
Yes, please.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, next slide, please. Oh, right, video. So essentially, this is simply just an export. It contains the delegation chains, dependencies, and multiple SUIT processors, and unlinked directive. Next, please. There is a dependency from TEEP on this particular draft, although I don't know if that's been declared yet. It's just the things that I know TEEP depends on got moved to this draft. Next, please. So delegation chains are essentially just a list of lists of CBOR web tokens. The idea behind this is that in each list, the first element is a CWT that can be verified against a trust anchor, and the last element is contains the key that you can use to verify a manifest. So it's essentially just a chain of signed elements, each one containing a public key. Each element should authenticate the following one in each individual list. And obviously there's options for a device to skip ahead if it recognizes something. Next, please. Dependencies, so these are a fundamental component of SUIT, or were, and they've heavily influenced the design of SUIT. This is why SUIT has multiple sections rather than one single list of elements it should, or one single list of things it should do. This essentially, it was for dependency lockstep processing that was that the SUIT command sequences were split apart like that. And there's all the requirements of dependencies that come with that. And it's also necessary to support encrypted manifests. I think that's an important thing to recognize. Next slide, please. So integrated dependencies are when a dependency is placed in the SUIT envelope, and that will be probably how encrypted manifests are typically delivered. And those are covered in this document as well. And they have the same reference semantics as I described for integrated elements in the previous presentation. Next, please. Multiple SUIT processors are also covered, and that's when you have multiple mutually distrustful processing environments in a single device. In the classic IoT case, the most likely thing I've encountered is a radio module that has a signature of its own firmware, and that is signed by a different trust anchor than the firmware for the application, which is running on a separate processor. So the idea behind multiple SUIT processors is that you have a dependency that has its own signature, and it hands over a component to another processor, which then processes its own SUIT manifest and returns some status information. Next slide, please. The unlinked directive was specifically requested by TEEP. I'm not sure if it's quite in the right form, and I think we'll have a debate about that within the TEEP discussion this week, but that's also covered in this document. Next slide, please.
Yeah, I just want to give a quick add here that the TEEP session is the first session on Friday morning. And so that one, the TEEP session will be discussion of the use of SUIT in TEEP. Akira and Ken are both here in this meeting, and they both filed issues relating to SUIT manifests in TEEP. And so I'd like to encourage everybody that wants to follow this topic to also please come to that meeting, because we're not going to have time to discuss it here, but there may be time in the TEEP meeting on Friday. So.
Then there is just the question of the open issues. We don't have any running code for most of it. I'm concerned that we're about whether or not we're using the CBOR web tokens correctly. And yeah, any contribution would be massively welcome. That's it.
Both this document and the other one that was the update management are both draft Moran right now. This is a question of the working group. Both of these have, I think, content that was originally pulled out of the original SUIT manifest document so that we could take the original one as the minimal one and go to RFC as soon as possible. And I think none of the content was pulled out of there because people objected it to having it be in SUIT. And so I guess the proposal that I would have would be, are there any objections to taking both of these documents and adopting them as draft IETF RATS documents to put them back as official working group documents, which they were before, right? That should be, I believe, the next step. I just wanted to verify that there's no objections to that. Yeah, draft IETF RATS. Thank you, Michael.
I prefer draft IETF SUIT personally.
Yeah, sorry, draft IETF SUIT. Yeah, sorry if I missaid that. I just came from the RATS meeting right before this, sorry. Okay, as long as there's no objections, then that is the normal thing because these came out of a SUIT document to begin with. So they were already working with content before, so. All right, any other questions for Brendan? Especially on the open issues here, so.
running code for the integrated dependency will be coming.
That's great to hear.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't need an adoption call, just asking for objections because the content was already adopted. Yeah. Okay, so I think we're now out of time. And so any further discussion on this one in particular, since this is stuff that's used by TEEP, some of this will be in scope for discussion on Friday. So again, please come to the discussion on Friday, first agenda slot or first meeting slot on Friday. So thank you all. Anything else you wanted to add, Dave or Russ, before we close the meeting?
Just Brendan, post the documents and we'll approve them.
Yeah.
So I should repost them as draft IETF then.
Yes,
yeah,
please.
and you can do that during the week if you want to. So
will do.
All right. Thank you all.
bye.
Bye, guys. Meeting minutes are done.